Hello again. Today I wanted to talk a little about the idea of gatekeeping in the pagan and witchcraft community. I know it's sort of a big, complicated topic, but I had talked a little in another video about the sort of problem that I perceive modern paganism and witchcraft having with the concept of the Christian devil or Satan. So since I already went out and had an opinion on that topic, why not have an opinion about gatekeeping, which is something that I see kind of going on in a variety of different pagan and witchcraft contexts. And it's something that really bothers me, so I might as well make a video about it, I suppose. And basically what gatekeeping is, as I understand it, is when people, particularly within a community, decide to have an opinion or to enforce who can or can't also be part of that community. Now, right from the beginning, this is really problematic when we're talking about paganism or witchcraft. As I mentioned in the previous video talking about the devil in a witchcraft or pagan context, specifically in a witchcraft context, witchcraft is almost impossible to define as a community and to make any definitive statements about as a group. When we get people who are upset about TV's portrayal of witchcraft or a statement about witchcraft or pretty much anything that has to do with witchcraft, it's immediately sort of a problem because it's just such a widespread, all-encompassing term and practice that really, whatever we're saying about it, there's going to be someone or some group out there somewhere in the world who contradicts it in some way. And I actually think that's a good thing. I've always been a big advocate for diversity in any community. I think that it's healthy for a community to have diversity, even when we're talking about culturally specific practices. Take Celtic Reconstruction, for example, or heathenry, for example, which are two communities that I've been part of for, let's just say, a long time. Let's not clarify exactly how old I am in this video, so we'll just say a long time. But even when we're looking at very culturally focused or culturally specific types of pagan communities, I think it's still good to have diversity going on. When things get too homogenous, that's not healthy for the community. And that also, in my personal opinion, keep in mind these videos are all really just me talking from my personal opinion perspective, but having too much homogeny in any community also, in my opinion, really is what lends itself to some of these other problems that we see going on in communities where, how to put this in the politest and least offensive way, you start to see the community itself getting rather homogenous, shall we say. And then not only are people gatekeeping in a wider sense, but they also start gatekeeping in extremely problematic ways, which we see in, I'll use heathenry for an example, which kind of fights against this invasion by white nationalists and racists. Horribly, horribly bad, by the way. There are lots of good heathens out there that are fighting against that and resisting that. But in my own opinion, once again, I'm going to keep emphasizing that, in my own opinion, I think part of what contributes to people trying to keep out other people who they feel don't look right or come from the right ethnic background or speak the right language or come from the right country or, pick whatever it is, really gets back and gets rooted in this idea of homogeny. Obviously, any particular community or group has to have some boundaries that define it. You have to have something that makes that community what it is. When we're talking about culturally specific paganism, that's going to be your boundary and your definition. With Celtic Reconstruction, your boundary and your definition is going to be that you use that modality, that you use the Reconstructionist methodology to approach Celtic spirituality. But that's kind of it for the boundary. And I highly recommend checking out the Celtic Facts, FAQs, to find out more specifically about Celtic Reconstruction. But I'm picking that as an example because a lot of people look at that and think, oh, but I would have to have Celtic, I hate the term Celtic, but Celtic ancestry in order to be a Celtic Reconstructionist. Or, oh, I would have to live in a Celtic country, or I would have to fit these specific criteria in order to be a Celtic Reconstructionist. But actually, no. Yes, there are going to be people who, again, try to gatekeep the community and set up these different qualifications, but the reality is no, you just have to be someone who's using a Reconstructionist methodology to approach Celtic spirituality. It's very straightforward. The same thing with heathenry. Actually, heathenry is even more broad than Celtic Reconstruction, quite frankly, because there's many different approaches to how you can practice heathenry. Heathenry isn't in and of itself a Reconstructionist religion, necessarily. So, why am I getting into all of this? My point is, those are things that people tend to just have this assumption is going to be more homogeneous by nature. And I think those assumptions and that homogeneous approach that some people tend to bring into it or apply to it cause problems. They do. And this is my experience from having been involved in these communities over, well, we'll just say decades. A decade for heathenry and a couple decades for Celtic Reconstruction. It seems to me, in my experience, in my opinion, that the more homogeneous a community tries to stay, and these are all not organic, living, traditional communities. These are created, constructed communities of people coming together to try to create these pagan communities. The more they try to make them extremely restricted, religious, focused communities, they try to make them homogenous, where everything is as similar and alike as possible. The more you start to see these problems springing up with, and I'm not calling out anything in specific here, so nobody get offended and start commenting on this video, just giving examples, with racism and xenophobia and all of those other problems that we are now dealing with on much larger scales in some cases, to the point that there are groups dedicated to, heathens fighting against racism, heathens fighting against white nationalism. There are Celtic anti-hate groups as well, and those have been created to fight these people coming in to the communities and trying to enforce this very racially, ethnically, linguistically, etc. based homogeny. Why am I emphasizing all this in a video about gatekeeping? Because I do want to say from the beginning that obviously any group needs to have some boundaries that define it. However, this becomes a problem when the boundaries are so emphasized and so restricted that they become self-limiting and self-defeating and feed into and lead to these very serious problems, which we are in fact seeing. This is a problem. This is a problem in the modern communities. I mean, to acknowledge that it's a problem and be aware of it so that we can resist it and fight against it. But boundaries are important. Definitions are important. Otherwise, it's all just chaos, and we have no self-definitions, and we have no focus, and we basically have no community at all. That's not good either. So I think, and this is where I'm getting to the gatekeeping point, that when we have people who are trying to engage in gatekeeping, at least in some cases, it's a mistake that's coming from not necessarily a bad place, but the idea that if they don't enforce some sort of rigid structure, everything's going to be chaos, and their idea of what their particular path is going to be lost and overtaken by these other things. And there is some legitimacy to that general thought. I think where we need to be super careful when we're looking at who we do or do not want in our wider community is trying to keep out people who are obviously legitimately dangerous to other people, and trying to keep out people who, even if they're not actively dangerous, are advocating things that are dangerous, if not to us directly, to other people. So, again, Nazis are bad. I wouldn't think I would have to say that, but it's 2018 and I have to say that. So it is perfectly fine, and that degree of gatekeeping, to say this is not okay. I am a big advocate of inclusion when it comes to gender identification and sexual orientation. So I have no issue, personally, saying that we do need to be clear about including that, and about being careful not to be so open to people who have philosophies that advocate harm to other people who might be part of gender minorities or sexual orientation minorities, that we're going to cause harm to those groups. Obviously, I'm biased, but that is something we need to consider. It is okay to draw certain lines in the sand, as it were. It is also okay when it comes to sexual predators. That's another thing that is a big issue in the pagan community at large right now that people struggle with. For some reason, that totally baffles me. We seem to have this very bizarre, ingrained, obsessive either-or mentality that says either we have absolutely no boundaries and no self-definition, and we just let absolutely everybody in, and we don't in any way try to define who it is okay and who it isn't okay to be part of our community. Or we are extremely restrictive and selective to the point that we're keeping out people who should be allowed in, but we're super, super selective and restrictive. And it really is a logical fallacy. It baffles me. It does not have to be this way. It is perfectly fine to say, no white nationalists, no TERFs, no sexual predators. All of these are bad things. We do not want them in the wider community. But also to acknowledge that we do not want those in our wider community, and we're going to say, I do not agree that these people are part of my personal spiritual path, while still acknowledging, yes, they are heathens or witches or pagans. Because this is where the weird thing comes in for me. When we see these sort of scandals in other religions where something comes out that a person is any of the above things I just listed, you don't see this big disavowal where, that person is not a Christian. Maybe they're not following the actual philosophies and teachings of Christianity, but they don't actually get kicked out of Christianity. I don't think Christianity works that way. I don't actually know. And yet when those same sorts of things happen within different pagan communities, there's this really quick, disavowal. And that becomes something that's kind of used as a weapon. Yes, it can seem like a positive thing when we're saying, no, this person who did this horrible thing is not really a witch. But it can also be used, and is often used, against people that someone just doesn't like, or is unpopular for whatever reason in the community. Or, and I see this all the time, is a group or a particular set of practices that the sort of bigger mainstream, particularly American witchcraft or pagan culture doesn't approve of. And then it becomes, well, they aren't really witches or pagans. I don't think we get to decide that. And I know I've taken a long time in this video to sort of get around to this and talked about a lot of other things as well, but I think we kind of have to lay this whole groundwork because this is a complicated topic and there's so much confusion around it and this either-or mindset. You know, we can say, my particular spiritual tradition does not want this person involved in it. Or my particular spiritual tradition has kicked this person out because of things that they did. But I don't think we can turn around then and also say that makes that person not a witch or not a pagan. We might not like that they are. We might hate that they are, even, depending on what they did and what's going on with them. But I don't think we get to decide someone else's spirituality, just in general. We don't get to decide because we don't like who they are or what they're doing or what they're saying, that therefore they aren't what they say they are. And this, I think, is the key to the whole gatekeeping mentality. It comes down to control. And the idea that by saying this person isn't a pagan or this person isn't a witch, you get to control what that person is or is not. And that just isn't how that works. If I say that I'm a witch, even if you think I'm not, even if you think that, you know, no matter what my backstory is, no matter what my practices are, you decide that I'm not really a witch because I don't fit your specific parameters for what a witch is, you don't get to make that decision. And that goes both ways. I don't get to decide that anyone else out there is or is not what they say they are when it comes to spirituality. That's just how spirituality works. It's a very personal thing. You know whether you are or are not what you say you are, whether that's a pagan or a witch or, you know, whatever. We just don't, from the outside, get to decide what another person is or is not. And I see so much gatekeeping in the pagan community, in the witchcraft community, and it really bothers me. Yes, if it's a particular organization. Certain particular organizations, anyway. If you have to have a membership in something, if it's the sort of thing where you can have your initiation or your degrees revoked, where you can be disavowed or whatever the technical term would be, kicked out, then yes, that group can decide whether you are or are not. I happen to have gotten my Reiki certifications a long time ago. Again, we won't discuss how long because it'll make me sound old. I got it a long time ago. Once you have a Reiki certification, you are Reiki certified forever. It's attunements. People can't take those away. No one can decide at some point, even if I stopped practicing Reiki and decided it was all hooey and never did it again, nobody can decide later on that I'm not a Reiki practitioner because they don't think that I am. That's not something that an outside person gets to decide. It's not like being a member of an organization where I have to pay dues and be on a membership list, and that's a different situation. I'm trying to explain this so that it's clear to everyone, because this isn't an either or. It's not yes, either we can decide people do or do not belong to things, or no, we can't. If you are part of a specific coven and the coven kicks you out, which happens because politics and personal drama and whatever, then they can say, no, that person is not part of our group. That is legitimate. If you are part of something that's a wider practice, then no, nobody can just say you aren't what you say you are. I had started years ago at this point a practice that I call fairy witchcraft. I have books about it. I talk about it sometimes. I don't get to decide who is or is not practicing fairy witchcraft. Fairy, because there's several different versions of fairy witchcraft out there. It's also very confusing, by the way. That's a long story as to why it's called that. I don't want to get into it in this video, but the particular version that I started, I don't get to decide, even though I kind of put it out there when I wrote my first book about it. I don't get to decide who is and is not a witch practicing that particular path. That's not how it's set up. That's not how it works. If you feel that you're called to that and that that's your practice, then that's you. And if that's your witchcraft, that's your witchcraft. And particularly when we're gatekeeping in paganism and witchcraft, if you're a pagan, if you honor pagan gods, no matter how you do it, whether I or anyone else agrees with how you do it, it does not matter. You are still a pagan. If you're offering them Kool-Aid and Twinkies, you're still a pagan. That's just spirituality. We don't, from the outside, get to decide whether you're legitimate enough to be real. I'm doing little air quotes because, yeah. The same thing with witchcraft. There's so many different kinds of witchcraft out there, and it really bothers me when I see witches telling other witches, you're not a real witch. I've made multiple different little social media memes about this because it bothers me that much. We just don't get to tell other people you are a witch or you aren't a witch based on our own personal opinions. If you feel like you're a witch, you feel like what you're doing is witchcraft, then it is. If you feel like you're not, then other people don't get to tell you that you are because they think you are or they think you should be. If you're not comfortable with that label and that term, you don't have to accept it. That is the miracle of individual spirituality. Yay! So, yeah, jazz hands, sorry. And that's kind of my whole purpose. I realize this video is getting super long, but I just really wanted to emphasize with the whole gatekeeping thing that, yes, it is perfectly okay to be against gatekeeping and against dictating other people's spirituality, but also to acknowledge that, yes, as a community, we can say that we are not okay with certain people's philosophies or approaches, particularly when they're harmful to other people. We can say that's not part of my spirituality, that's not the witchcraft that I practice, I don't agree with that, that's not my heathenry. We just have to be really careful when we start dictating whether those people, however disagreeable they may be, and believe me, I know how disagreeable they can be. We just have to be really careful in dictating and trying to say they are not heathens or pagans or witches, just because we don't like them and don't like what they're saying. Gatekeeping is super problematic. We don't get to dictate other people's spirituality, like it or not. So, some food for thought here. I know I rambled a bit and I covered a lot, but please give it some thought. Give some thought to that whole either-or mentality, and look at the fact that it is okay to have standards and to want our community, whatever community you feel you're part of, to be the best that it can be, and that it is okay to say we don't want certain people to be associated with us or to be at public events with us or whatever the case may be, but that we can also still agree that gatekeeping is a big problem, and that we in particular can't be dictating other people's spiritual identities or spirituality or inclusion in that wider sense of whether they are or are not what they say they are, label-wise. We just don't get to decide that for other people. Obviously, I'll wrap this up by saying there are some very few specific exceptions. If you have someone who is clearly European or European American who's claiming to practice and teach Native American things, there are specific words for that. Plastic shaman comes to mind right away. That is highly problematic, and that is not a case where a person can just decide they are and they are. Cultural appropriation, whole separate issue. My friend Laura O'Brien just did a video where she talks about cultural appropriation. In her video, she's specifically addressing in the Irish culture, but I highly recommend checking that video out to get a little more on where cultural appropriation can come into this, and as a slightly separate but related issue to gatekeeping, where yes, you cannot in fact just decide that you are part of something that you're not actively working and putting real effort into being part of, and that you're not being accepted by that indigenous culture. If you're not a tribal member, if you're not accepted or adopted into a tribe, you can't just decide that you're a tribal member. That is not how that works, to quote a commercial. So, that's a slightly separate issue. I do want to touch on that here at the very end. Check out Laura O'Brien's video for more detail on cultural appropriation. But outside of that, I think I've talked as much about gatekeeping as I possibly can, probably more than you ever wanted to hear me say on the subject. Go forth, give it some thought, and hopefully maybe reconsider the next time you have a knee-jerk reaction to tell someone that they're not really a witch just because you don't like what they're doing. It actually really bothers me personally when I see how quick we are in general as a community to make fun of or mock other people because we think they wear too much pink and have too much glitter, or wear too much black and have too many skulls on their altars. Just saying. We're kind of a snarky, salty, shade-throwing, mean community sometimes. And maybe we need to look at whether that's really helpful for new people coming in, or whether we're really hurting ourselves in the long run. You can probably guess which one of those I'm favoring here. But, maybe just consider whether being mean to people for no reason, because we don't think they're fitting our definition of what a witch should be or should look like or should believe or should act like, is actually that helpful and constructive. Think about it. And I will see everyone next time.